Okay, good afternoon, all of you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Makerere Institute of Social Research, which I have actually visited a couple of times in the past. I've always found it to be a very lively intellectual space, and I'm very happy to be virtually meeting you all today. As you know, I'm going to speak on the ways in which the idea of decolonization had been, on the one hand, appropriated by the right wing and on the other hand, attacked by the left wing. And I'm going to talk about that whole debate. And I'm going to talk about why I think that we should still be able to use the framework of decolonization, taking it away from both these ends, as it were. Now, speaking from India, let me say that, so I'm going to use the word Hindutva several times in this talk, and some of you may be familiar, but it refers to the political ideology based on the claim that only Hindus have a right to India. So Hindutva is the political ideology of a kind of ethno-fascism and an ethno-majoritarianism. So what has been happening is that the ideologues of Hindutva, but also the right wing globally, have been appropriating the idea of decolonizing. And it seems to many opposed to these trends, to this kind of right-wing, to these right-wing trends, it has seemed to many opposed to these trends that scholarship around decoloniality itself must be the problem, if it can be appropriated in this way. Now, we have seen such arguments earlier on post-colonial scholarship around the 1990s that virtually accused it of directly contributing to the rise of the right. At this time, however, it is post-colonial and Marxist scholarship that makes such accusations of decolonial scholarship. Decolonial scholarship is relatively a new arrival in the Anglophone world since the 2000s, let's say, and ever since the right wing started using that language, the same charges are laid at its door as well. Indeed, the implication and sometimes the outright allegation is that decolonial scholars were secretly right-wing all along. This charge I will address in three different ways. In the first part of my talk, I will make analogies with other bodies of knowledge to ask the question, is there a pure incorruptible knowledge that can never be appropriated? In other words, if one can establish that, then one could say that decolonialism is particularly amenable to being appropriated. So I'm obviously going to argue against the idea of a pure incorruptible knowledge, and I'll make analogies with other bodies of knowledge. In the next section, I will very briefly address another, actually quite commonly made a critique of decolonial thought, that it is merely epistemic. So I'm going to put merely in quotation marks here. And the critique is that it's merely epistemic because Walter Mignolo, who's seen as one of the key figures associated with decolonial thought, talks about epistemic disobedience, and other such terms are used. So merely epistemic as opposed to the materiality of structures of power. This is another critique. And finally, we will ask the question, when Hindutva and the right wing in general claim to be decolonizing, what are they doing exactly? Are they really decolonizing? Now, before I go into these three sections of my talk, let me first address the issue of the distinction that we do need to make between post-colonial thought and decolonial thought, between the framework of post-colonialism and the framework of decolonial thought. There are three significant differences between the two. First, post-colonial thought emerged from a different spatio-temporal context. It emerged from the British Anglophone colonies, while decolonial thought emerged from the Spanish colonies. This means that the community with which each communicates is different. The histories of colonialism are different. For decolonial thinking, for example, colonialism began in 1492 with Christopher Columbus, whereas for Asia and Africa, the colonial phase is seen to begin later. The pre-colonial worlds are different. The bodies of scholarship within which there are ongoing conversations are different. This is the first difference. And I think it's very important to recognize this as a difference, because the idea of location is key to decolonial thinking and to thinking from the global south. By location, I could refer to, for example, Mignolo again. You are where you think. That is to say that you are located in a particular space and time. In that space and time, you carry different kinds of historical identities, and your voice emerges from there. This is not an idea that will be particularly surprising to any of you in the room. But if we're going to take location seriously, then the two specific spatiotemporal locations of post-colonial thought and decolonial thought do make a difference to the ways in which they set up conversations. A second, a very important difference between the two is that post-colonial thinking claims European modernity for itself while being critical of it. So a famous instance is Dipesh Chakrabarty's formulation that European thought is both inadequate and indispensable. That is to say, it is inadequate, but it is indispensable. So this body of scholarship is concerned then with correcting the distortions of European thinking and producing a modernity that aligns better with the realities of the global south. For post-colonial thinking, secularism, in the sense of keeping the religious and spiritual in the non-political domain, is a given. That understanding of secularism, that the religious and the spiritual must be in the non-political domain, as you would know, and it may come up in discussion, there are multiple ways in which we can understand secularism, but this is the way in which secularism emerged from the European Enlightenment. So for post-colonial thinking, secularism of that sort is a given. Decolonial thought, on the other hand, rejects the constellation of features termed modernity altogether, as it is seen as only the lighter side, as it were, of colonialism. That is to say that colonialism and modernity are seen as two sides of the same coin, and we're only allowed to see the lighter side, not the darker side, colonialism. We see modernity, the lighter side. So whereas post-colonial thought engages with modernity, with modernity, with this set of features that emerged from Europe in the 18th century, which is called modernity, post-colonial thought engages with this critically and tries to, for example, a new book by Nikita Dhawan calls it, the title of the book is Rescuing Enlightenment from the Europeans. So to take its values and reconstitute them for our purposes. Whereas decolonial thinking rejects the constellation of features termed modernity altogether. And decolonial thought is therefore more about recovering heterogeneity. And this includes, it's very important, reinstating indigenous spiritualities from modern organized religion. That is, reinstating indigenous spiritualities while separating itself from modern organized religion. Now, this is how I see decolonial thought. We'll see how Hindutva uses it in a minute. A third difference is that while post-colonial studies emerge from and are located in the academic field of the secular humanities, decolonial thinking has not been an academic discipline alone. It has included community activists, artists, scholars critical of modern Western secularism, who have drawn from and contributed to religious studies as well. Nelson Maldonado Torres, for example, marks what he calls the decolonial turn in Latin America as being in fact produced by an overdetermined conjuncture in which militant indigenous movements are crucial. Hence, he uses the term combative decoloniality. So decolonial thought has always seen itself as arising from and located in indigenous activist spaces, whereas post-colonial thought is part of a secular modern academy. Now, as you can see in each of these, there is an insistence on location to which I referred. So one could ask, is this insistence on location a betrayal of transnational solidarities? Is it a rejection of the ways in which colonial differences endure and bind us? I ask this question because this question has been raised by scholars Kiran Ashar and Preeti Ramamurthy. That is to say that their anxiety or their criticism is that by insisting on location, we are betraying transnational solidarities. I don't agree with this criticism. For the question of location, implying that thought emerges from specific spatio-temporal conjunctures and is not unanchored and abstract, is for me central to the very idea of intellection from the global south. This is not a claim to ahistoric indigeneity or to authenticity or to superiority vis-a-vis the West, a stance very familiar in India from the Hindutva nationalist framework. A sensitivity to location invariably leads to a productive contamination of the purity of empty universalist categories with specific histories, thus challenging their claim to speak about everywhere from nowhere, pointing towards unexpected other histories that unsettle the idea of a single point of origin. Does this mean that no conversations are possible? No solidarities are possible? On the contrary, what I'm suggesting is that conversations across contexts are possible, and in such conversations, we sometimes hear resonances and sometimes recognize disjunctures. Taken together, these enable the mapping of new ground. For example, one of the problems with decolonial framework is that it is unable to grasp how caste, unlike race, is not constitutive of modernity. So race is constitutive of modernity in this understanding, but caste is not. Indeed, modernity, that is to say, caste has a much older history than this constellation of features that we term modernity. And modernity in fact provides a radically new way of conceptualizing the indignity and violence of caste, which goes back to millennia and emerges from the Vedas in India. So the decolonial framework is not able to actually engage with caste seriously. And while the colonial concretizing of caste differences played a role, there is no doubt that the British government did take concrete steps to, for example, end caste discrimination in schools. So when I say conversations which can lead to resonances and disjunctures, you can see, I don't see this as a reason to reject the decolonial framework. I see this as a fact, something that we need to factor in, that while taking on board indigenous spiritualities is crucial and important, there are multiple indigenous spiritualities. And what is produced as spirituality by any ethno-nationalist movement like Hindutva is only its most dominant version. And in any case, since we're comparing decolonial and post-colonial frameworks, the post-colonial framework rooted in modernity has also been unsuccessful in capturing caste, because the framework of modernity does not allow identities like race and caste to be given space. And we'll see that in a little while as we go along. Now, I think I should say right away that, having set out these differences between post-colonial and decolonial frameworks, that I follow the understanding that they are both options, in Mignolo's words, and neither needs to be seen as inherently superior or better. They address different issues, imagine different futures. But for the record, I locate myself in the field of decolonial thought, even while being located in an Anglophone academic universe. I find decolonial thought productively destabilizing. So now the first part of my talk, I will be addressing the question, as I said, of whether there is any form of knowledge that is pure and incorruptible. That is to say, if decolonial thought is being appropriated by the global right, is it that other kinds of progressive thought are somehow immune? So what is this idea of knowledge that underlie critiques that see decolonial thought as complicit with right-wing appropriations of it? There seems to be the idea that there's some true and good knowledge, let's call this K1, which is unamenable to being appropriated by the enemy. If the enemy, that is K1, casts some kinds of thinking as the enemy, so if the enemy, that is those whom K1 casts as the enemy, legitimates itself using any elements of another body of knowledge, K2, K1 will reject K2 as tainted, complicit, and impossible to engage with. And if there are critiques of other knowledges, such as K1, that underlie K2, then they are also therefore proved to be wrong because the enemies of K1 have been able to appropriate K2. And it is assumed that K1 is immune from appropriation or misunderstanding. And if it ends up serving the interests of power, that is accidental or an aberration. Now, in the context of this attack on decolonial thinking, what I'm calling K1, that is this assumed incorruptible pure knowledge, is the assumed universalism and telos of the European Enlightenment, and the particular constellation of features that emerges in Europe over the 18th century and gets canonized as modernity. Since decolonial thinking, K2, in the framework that I just outlined, casts colonialism not as an aberration, but as the flip side of modernity and the European Enlightenment, all politics and thinking that rejects or claims to reject the West, something called the West, including ethno-nationalisms of the right, are assumed to be necessarily produced by decolonial thinking. Now, I find this logic quite spurious, to be frank, because what the argument is that this Enlightenment knowledge is pure, and any critique of Enlightenment knowledge necessarily leads to, or is in fact produced by, right-wing and ethno-nationalist kind of thought. Now, for example, what else would we then have to reject as right-wing? Let me consider a few examples. That is to say, is there any pure incorruptible knowledge? Let's consider a few instances. In today's world, the most obvious instance that occurs to me is the fact that Israel uses queer politics to justify itself as the only democracy in West Asia, as it gives equal rights to homosexuals, but of course we know it gives equal rights to Jewish homosexuals. Now, this is called pinkwashing. We do not, in response, reject queer politics as a whole as complicit with and enabling Zionism and genocide in Palestine. Instead, we call this pinkwashing and present another queer politics that is instead anti-imperialist, democratic, and anti-capitalist. Anyone who's familiar with feminism knows the extent to which feminism can be appropriated by, for example, militaristic nation states, as the USA did. I'm just going to give a few examples. The USA did during the bombing of Iraq, which counterposed its modern liberated women soldiers to the Muslim patriarchy oppressed, veiled Iraqi women. More recently, the Indian government presented women soldiers as the face of the military operation against Pakistan, producing itself as feminist and secular vis-a-vis supposedly backward and regressive Pakistan. And this has been celebrated not only by the complicit media, but by some who claim to be feminists. But other feminist voices have been almost entirely critical, pointing out the hypocrisy and contradictions underlying this strategy. A kind of liberal feminism is sometimes claimed by the Hindu right in India, and that has mobilized women in their violent and Islamophobic politics, as many scholars have shown. So is feminism to be rejected as having enabled militaristic and religious identity-based exclusionary nationalism? So what I'm saying is, so if you take feminism and queer politics as an example, they're appropriated by neoliberalism and capitalism. International Women's Day and Queer Pride become just another marketing opportunity, evacuating these of their radical content. In a move similar to the attacks on post-colonial and decolonial thought, you might be familiar with Nancy Fraser, with this essay, you may be familiar with this essay. Nancy Fraser in 2013 wrote an essay accusing feminism, a certain kind of feminism, liberal, individualistic, meritocratic, oriented towards success in the market, of becoming the handmaiden of neoliberalism. Not only was this feminism compatible with neoliberalism, said Fraser, it had actually contributed to neoliberalism's arsenal. So, see, it's not just that it was appropriated, but the argument, as we see with the critiques on decolonialism, is that feminism contributed to neoliberalism's arsenal by its critique of the family bait, thus enabling the legitimation of flexible capitalism, which relied on the cheap labor of women. So this kind of, so for example, and by its critique of exclusive focus on class exploitation and drawing attention to domestic violence and sexual assault, and third, by its criticism of welfare state paternalism, all of this contributed to neoliberalism, is what Fraser argues. But I find, again, this critique entirely unsustainable. Attributing to feminism the power to produce neoliberalism is surely overestimating it considerably. And just as surely the social welfare state was hardly dismantled on the grounds that feminism was critical of it. So we find that globally, the phenomenon has been noted across the USA, Europe, and Latin America that anti-feminist, anti-democratic leaders are using the language of anti-feminism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism, but in the same breath, they use the language of tropes of democracy and equality, including the language of women's rights, and a commitment to the appointment of women as high-level executive officials and judges. So this phenomenon has got a name now. It's called abusive feminism. Rosalind Dixon uses this term, abusive feminism. Unlike Fraser, she does not accuse feminism of having mothered authoritarian dictatorships, but examines the processes by which feminism is selectively appropriated in these contexts. We know that Marxism too has been claimed to be authoritarian, anti-democratic, and violent regimes from Stalin to Pol Pot have been used as an example to attack Marxism. Ecologically unsustainable capitalist interventions are justified by regimes following a certain kind of Marxist understanding. So in short, I've given some examples to show that there is no pure knowledge that cannot be appropriated to ends opposite to its claims. This includes thought based on the assumed universal truths of the European Enlightenment, some of the principles of which, equality, democracy, post-colonial thought, decolonial thought definitely espouses. Decolonial thought valorizes these principles too, but while rejecting the claim, so this is the difference. Decolonial thought too considers equality and democracy to be important values, but rejects the claim, unlike post-colonialism, that these values were introduced by the European Enlightenment for the first time in the history of the world. This is the problem post-colonial thought has, that these values were introduced by the European Enlightenment. Rejecting modernity as simply the lighter side of colonialism means we have to reject these values as well. And in fact, decolonial thinking shows that these values were not introduced by the European Enlightenment for the first time in the history of the world. Decolonial theorists argue that the pluriverses that existed before the Columbian era, long before the European Enlightenment, ideas of freedom and equality were debated both with reference to the imperialists as well as internally. So there are examples of that are given of African intellectuals, of Quechua intellectuals of the late 16th, early 17th century. You have David Graeber and David Wengrow showing that the values attributed to the European Enlightenment have much older non-European histories. And though they do not explicitly use a decolonial framework, their argument is relevant here, that the idea of the desirability of equality was brought to Europe through the encounter of Europeans with the indigenous peoples of North America in the 17th century. So one should add here, the very argument that these values were brought into the world by the European Enlightenment is challenged by decolonial thought, which looks at the histories of pre-Columbian in the Latin American context and pre-colonial in other contexts, the ways in which these ideas were being discussed and being produced in these spaces. And one should, of course, perhaps I don't even need to say this, but I should just still quickly say that decolonization refers to the phenomenon of the formal exit of colonial powers and is, in that sense, a much narrower term. Decolonization is not complete. From the decolonial understanding, decolonization is not complete until a just and equal society is established after colonial rule ends. So this is the first section in which I suggest that the critique of decolonial thinking. So as you know, the idea is to, in a sense, respond to both left critiques as well as right-wing appropriations. I'll come to the right-wing appropriations in a minute. But at this point, we are still addressing the left critique. So one kind of critique is that decolonial thought can be used by the right wing, and therefore it must be inherently impure, flawed, corrupt. And I've suggested that there is no such pure, incorruptible form of knowledge. The second kind of argument that is made, which I will discuss very briefly, is that because I'm surprised that this critique is made and taken seriously, but I do feel that we can set it aside very quickly, but it may come up in the discussion. So the second part of my lecture addresses the left charge, the charge from the left, that decolonial thought is merely epistemic as opposed to being material and taking into account materialities. Epistemic disobedience is just thought, it's just thinking. Now, I believe this distinction to be unsustainable from a materialist standpoint informed by Marx. The capitalist transformation of material structures of society is enabled not merely by force, violence, and coercion, which are of course necessary, but by the transformation of common sense alongside. The idea that matter comes first and is independent of thought is precisely what Marx devastatingly critiques in Theses on Feuerbach. Sensuous objects and thought objects are not separate, as Feuerbach's contemplative, as he puts it, materialism holds. Rather, sensuousness involves thought. Materiality involves thought. Epistemic transformation may, in fact, precede material transformation, as in the colonies, where the elites of the colonies were brought into agreement with the colonial masters regarding their own backwardness and the ground map needed to build modern, so-called modern futures. Futures in which, for example, indigenous peoples, forest peoples, and such others were seen as remnants of an earlier era which was to be transcended. The decolonial agenda of epistemic disobedience, therefore, in my understanding, is materialist, in the sense in which Marx understands materialism. As he put it in Capital One, referring to labor as conscious life activity, I quote, "At the end of the labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement," unquote. What one conceives of as possible, legitimate, appropriate, or comprehensible in the so-called real world is intimately tied to epistemic frameworks located in materiality. So I don't think that this criticism is valid, that it's merely epistemic and not materialist. And now we come to the third part of my lecture, where we want to look at what is the, so this is, the first part was where, addressing left critiques. Now I'm going to look at what is the right wing doing when it claims to be decolonizing. And I argue that what they're doing is not decolonizing. It's to some extent de-Westernizing, but not even fully that. But what it's doing is recolonizing. It's a new kind of colonizing, and I'll explain what that is in the Indian context. And one could apply this to the global right wing. In those specific contexts, one would have to look at studies. Now, when Hindutva claims to be decolonizing, what is going on exactly? My own understanding is that any project of decolonization has to embrace heterogeneity and undecidability in the Derridian sense of refusing meaning through established fixed codes. Coloniality is precisely the forging and enforcing of legibility to the state, of homogenizing all history and the entirety of the present. And this aspect of coloniality is very much the ambition of modernity as well. Hence the dyad of coloniality, modernity, and decolonial thought. James Scott, who is not ever seen actually as a post-colonial or decolonial scholar, but in Seeing Like a State, Scott demonstrates that the modern state, so he's not even in that sense coming from the decolonial framework, but he demonstrates that the modern state, whether colonial or independent, functions by making populations legible to itself through a series of homogenizing measures, such as imposition of uniform languages, units of measurement, so-called surnames in cultures across the global south where this naming practice did not exist, land tenure systems that set up individuals as owners from whom tax could be collected, and so on. This facilitates state control and capitalist advancement, or Stalinist state socialism. He discusses both. Now, just an aside here, so I do want to show that there are gaps in decolonial thinking. I mentioned caste earlier as not being constitutive of modernity, caste violence. Now, another point that I would like to make here as an aside is that while decolonial scholarship as exemplified by, I'm mentioning Mignolo because he's seen as the figure who has brought decolonial scholarship to the Anglophone world, drawing on Anibal Quijano and other scholars. But Mignolo is the person who we read, who is the figure who's also attacked and who's also the key figure of this framework. So while decolonial scholarship does assert heterogeneity as a value, one of Mignolo's weaknesses, for example, is that he sees some nation states of the global south, India, China, for example, as resisting coloniality and assumes them to be internally homogeneous. So this perspective is what led, so in fact, what happened was that Mignolo endorsed the blurbs that are at the back of books saying this is a great book, and I endorse it, right? Because it's superlative, etc. You've all seen those blurbs, which many of us have written, and we've all noticed it. So because he assumes these nation states, for some reason, he has a blind spot when it comes to nation states outside of Latin America. He sees India, China, etc. as standing up to coloniality. So this is the perspective which led to him endorsing a manifesto for Hindutva politics by one of their ideologues called J. Sai Deepak. And he endorsed the book. And of course, this is now the criticism that he has to bear continuously. And this is what has tainted decolonial thought forever, because Mignolo, I'm obviously being sarcastic when I say that, but from that point of view, yes, because Mignolo endorsed a book written by a Hindutva ideologue who believes that India is for Hindus and that minorities have no place, etc. So he then withdrew that endorsement after intervention by South Asian scholars. What must have, I'm imagining that for Mignolo, a book from the global south invoking indigeneity and decoloniality must have seemed to tick the right boxes. But as Kira Hu points out in the context of this, I'm quoting, in this emerging tradition of thought, the indigene of India, which is also called Bharat, and now that name Bharat is being more common, is being insistently used. Both names are in the constitution, but India was more commonly used, and now Bharat, which is part of supposedly the decolonizing move. In this emerging tradition of thought, the indigene of Bharat is not just any Indian, or as one might have expected, India's indigenous Adivasi communities. Adivasis are what are called scheduled tribes in India's constitutional language, but the Hindu. So when you talk, so what is happening when Hindutva uses the idea of decolonization is it's seeking to replace what it calls the West with the Hindu. But I will go on to show that it's actually a particular kind of very narrow version of the Hindu. And what marks the project of Hindutva is a homogenizing thrust. What Hindutva and other right-wing projects claiming decoloniality espouse in their supposed rejection of Western colonial modes of thought is, in fact, a recolonization by dominant frameworks of the contemporary elite. And it's a recolonization of the rich heterogeneity suppressed by coloniality and now suppressed by the dominant framework, which in India is Brahminical and capitalist. So it's not even Hindu in a broader sense, it is Brahminical, which is a very narrow, dominant strand which claims to represent all Hindus. For example, the Indian Penal Code, which was developed under the British, has been replaced by the Bharat. So it has now a very Sanskrit name, Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. And this change of name has been touted as a decolonizing move by the current regime in India. But when we look at what that new set of laws is, what we have been gifted with is a thoroughly colonial set of codes giving unprecedented power to the state to suppress dissent in glorious colonial style, but a new name for these laws in Sanskritized Hindi, a language which is in fact not accessible to most Indians. Another example of what happens with decolonizing is the continuous invocation of something that has come to be called Indian knowledge systems. These are now, this idea, these syllabi are now being incorporated all over the country in every discipline. It's being forcibly inducted to all syllabi of sciences, humanities, commerce, social sciences. It's almost, so what is Indian knowledge systems? It's almost exclusively Sanskritic. Now, Sanskrit is a language which is only actually used by Brahmins in religious practices. It has no real life. It's not a living language. It's like Latin, for example, but it's very elite. It's very elite. So it's almost exclusively Sanskritic. Indian knowledge systems. It refers to India. The India in the Indian knowledge systems is assumed to have eternally existed over millennia and ignores the multiplicity of practices and knowledges that the different communities of this subcontinent have evolved over time. For instance, a sample course, Philosophical Foundations of Ethics, which has been put up on the University Grants Commission site for an undergraduate course in commerce, states that it is based on, and I quote, Vedas, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Purana, Ramayana, Mahabharata, and other ancient literature. Now, all of these refer to one tradition, the Brahmanical tradition, that is sought to be imposed as Indian, despite claims to multiplicity of practices and knowledges. Or for that matter, you have IKS, they call it, Indian knowledge systems, in engineering universities, for example, claim that they're rooted in millennia of indigenous ecological wisdom, and IKS emphasizes harmony, offering frameworks like, again, a series of Sanskrit names, Panchabhuta, Vastu, etc. Now, these Sanskrit terms are not what hundreds of communities in this landmass would use to describe their ancient ecologically sustainable practices that have been almost entirely wiped out since independence, a process massively accelerated since 2014 when this regime came to power. The Hindutva the regime which is driven by Hindutva. Moreover, while pontificating on ancient harmony with nature, this particular regime actually has continuously tried to bring about capitalist transformations, whether in agriculture or in multiple other ways. So in agriculture, they passed 4 laws, which would have in fact completely devastated Indian agriculture and handed it over to both Indian capitalists and Western capitalists. These laws were eventually withdrawn on sustained militant protests by farmers who marched to the borders of Delhi and camped there for over a year. So it's farmers who fought against these laws, and the laws had to be withdrawn. But remember that these are, so when you're saying Indian knowledge systems, you're talking about ecological sustainability supposedly, but these are using terms that have no validity or meaning in real India. And in your actual practice, the government is, its actual practice, the government is in fact completely destroying nature and the environment. Forests have been shrinking alarmingly since 2014. I mean, the change is exponential since 2014. And as environmental controls are loosened for private capital, there is, for example, now the latest example is there are the Nicobar Islands, which are one of the, they're one of the world's most biodiverse areas. So there's a Great Nicobar Island project that has been passed, which is an environmental disaster of proportions that we cannot imagine. But millions of trees will have to, and mangrove forests, ancient forests, etc., will have to be destroyed. But importantly, from the point of view of so-called Indian knowledge systems, it involves the displacement of a tiny tribe, Shompen tribe, 300-member Shompen tribe, classified as a particularly vulnerable tribal group. Their knowledges, their lives, their language are apparently not Indian enough to be celebrated. So a capitalist Hindu Rashtra colonizing an indigenous people and their resources is what we see here. We also see that with this, so with the language of decolonization, so we see what is happening with the environment, we see what is happening with minority rights because of the presentation of Hindu as Indian. There's an assumption that Hindu is Indian, but as I will say again, it's not even Hindu, it's Brahminical Hinduism. We also come now to, how much longer do I have?
We're almost closing, but you can go ahead for another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes?
5 to 10.
Okay, another 5. Okay, I'll try and keep this to... I think then in that case, I will... there's some more India-specific material which I will leave and we can come to later, all of which illustrate that what is called decolonizing, what this regime is doing, is in fact recolonizing. It's replacing so-called West. To some extent, as I said, capitalism is not particularly indigenous. It's very Western. But the language, there's a kind of superficial replacement of the West by a very real Brahminical Hinduism. And you see that when it comes to women and feminism, you see that when it comes to ecology. So I'm going to skip a whole section, I mean the rest of this section, to come to so that's the third part really of my lecture, which is which looks at how do we reject or how do we criticize appropriations of the decolonial by the right wing, and I'm using Hindutva as an example, and how that appropriation is actually recolonizing. And in the North, there are European right wing parties which are using the framework of decolonialism as well, of decolonization as well, and there it's replacing. It's claiming to replace imperialism, but with white supremacism. I thought it would be interesting to conclude with now a different set of reflections which might be interesting for this audience located in the African continent. That I find it very interesting how Frantz Fanon is read in these two intellectual traditions, and it might, I think, bring the whole discussion together if I were to conclude with this, which is so Frantz Fanon is read very differently in the post-colonial tradition and in the decolonial tradition. So I will just very quickly talk about that and I'll conclude. I'll just indicate that and I'll conclude. From the decolonial perspective, Fanon is seen as offering a critique of the coloniality of the religion-secularism divide. He's seen as someone who's very interested in challenging this very divide of religion and secularism, which is seen as a part of the coloniality framework. So, for example, Nelson Maldonado Torres rejects the understanding of Fanon as a secularist philosopher, and he insists Fanon did not believe that overcoming religion is necessary for decolonization to take place, or that decolonization would lead to a religion-less society. And he gives the example of a paper that Fanon co-wrote with a colleague at the Blida Psychiatric Hospital in Algeria, which warns psychiatrists and other scientists that, and I quote Maldonado Torres quoting that paper, some conduct, some reactions can appear primitive to us. That is only a value judgment, one that is both questionable and bears on poorly defined characteristics. So this alerting their audience that some things that appear primitive to us are not, this is the wrong way to look at it. They were referring to the idea that jinn produce madness, jinn or jinni, the idea of spirits producing madness, a belief prevalent in Algeria. And Fanon wants psychiatrists to take that seriously, not as fact, but as something that one has to take into account, not as something primitive. So he concludes, Maldonado Torres concludes that Fanon's view of the self as a gift and his intersubjective account of healthy individuality and social relations draw from and are compatible with a large variety of sources, including so-called religious or spiritual formations. Now, on the other hand, we find that in mainstream European thought, particularly leftist and Marxist thought, and also in post-colonial thought, Fanon is seen as being of impeccably secular leftist credentials alone. And there's also a way in which, for example, Sartre, who wrote the introduction to Orphenoir, an essay which introduced this collection of poetry from Francophone Africa, Sartre suggests that, I know this from Fanon's heartfelt cry against that introduction. So I'm not going to be able to quote Sartre, I will quote Fanon, who cries out at Sartre's betrayal in Orphenoir, his essay introducing a collection of poetry from Francophone Africa, in which Fanon says, Sartre intellectualizes the experience of being Black. Sartre presented negritude as a minor term of a dialectical progression, Fanon says, as merely a transitory stage on the way towards becoming universal and towards the universal and abstract class identity. And in this essay that is translated as The Fact of Blackness, Fanon says, I quote, when I read that page, I felt as if I had been robbed of my last chance. Jean-Paul Sartre had forgotten that the Negro suffers in his body quite differently from the white man. So this, the understanding that the European intellectual world had, and which also passes into post-colonial thinking, of Fanon as a secular thinker who is yet to find his proper class identity and is somehow lost in his race identity, decolonial thought offers us a very different Fanon altogether. So I'll stop here and thank you for your patience.
Since we have read the materials, I would like to start by the overarching question subsequent to the conversation that has been initiated in the last 1 hour. That is, if post-colonial theory and the theory from post-colonial world are one and the same. So far, at least up to now in the conversation, I believe the answer is clearly not. If so, what are the likely disciplinary consequences of thinking of different possibilities of theoretical frameworks in doing theory, especially from the global south, that challenges structures of intellectual power, particularly within an institutional framework? I suppose this question emerges from the conversation on how to understand decolonization and decolonial thinking, both as a thought, a discourse, and a praxis. Interestingly, Professor Kusikani offers an entry point to this reading when she writes that, quote, how can the exclusive ethnocentric we be articulated with the inclusive we, a homeland for everyone that envisions decolonization? Articulation of quote unquote we demands the potential of epistemic decolonization of theory to rethink and reconfigure its conceptual foundations and dichotomies by inquiring what if theory is not universal and has a specific location. The exclusion, and both the exclusion and the exile, are often derived from the epistemic locations of the West that remain fraught within a racialized, colonial, capitalist, and androcentric hegemonic assumptions detached from historical and cultural specific social articulations. An interesting critique here is one that was offered by Professor Mario Lugones, who argued that Anibal Quijano's formulation of coloniality of power needed a critical rethinking as it obscured gender question within colonization, defining both sex and gender through the Eurocentric lens of patriarchy and heterosexuality, understanding the gender question. It leaves open the possibility that every particular experience is capable of being theorized. Therefore, there is a need to focus on theories from the global south, which are not necessarily detached from the theories of global north, because the West, as we know, have been penetrated by our ideas, which, as Professor Menon has been talking about. But yet there's an underlying assumption here that the West is coterminous with modernity. And I want to invoke the work of Raghuram Raju, who signaled the two theoretical, historically significant resources that shape the term West in itself: the destruction of its own pre-modern self and contrasting it with its own construction of the other. That is, in defining the East, the West is formulated. So if it is an epistemological need for an identity consolidation rather than a political program of colonial expansion, there seemed to be a necessitated the postulation of the other as different from the self. So modernity in the West did internalize as much as it incorporated the external circumstances. And Professor Menon, in her work, has stated that the values of modernity have always not been emancipatory, or it lacked emancipatory potential, as it often, to quote her words, eradicated spaces of relative autonomy and produced new spaces of subjection. Critical to this thought is reimagining and reinventing alternative epistemological conditions of possibilities to facilitate conservation, a conservation in having a conversation in doing theory. That is, we ought to define the we as those who reside within the Northwest, not in terms of geographical boundaries, but in the multitudinal experience of different forms of colonization. But it has not been an easy task, as clearly evidenced by Professor Menon in her talk. And in the readings of Professor Kusikani, who points out the pyramid structure of power within North American academy, with the elitist intellectuals continuing the process of knowledge production from the West, offering decolonization a distinctly epistemological and cultural cost. It has come to be associated with programs of institutional and curricular reform. This invites the question if the call for universities in the West to decolonize their syllabi has become a discursive project in itself. As we see, universities in the West today have been able to endorse the rhetoric of decolonization while suppressing Palestinian anti-colonial protests without having to amend the erasure of its past that rendered the Palestinians dehumanized ontological extras of a continuing Nakba under the colonial apartheid of Israel, while successfully maintaining ties with the settler colonial state of Israel in the face of a genocide that has killed academics, literally destroyed every single university in Gaza, and obliterated archives, chronicles, reportage, and often targeted assassinations of those who dare to document and record. If that is the case, this extends to a more discombobulating thought, that is, history as a discourse, if it's produced, well, it is being produced at the site of universities in the Western academy, then does it mean that West or Europe assumes a subject position of all histories, or one of an inanimate historical subject in itself? And that proves a humongous challenge in our ability to practice decolonization, or to even think within the realm of a decolonial discourse. To this effect, I don't think anyone has been farthest from the truth when Professor Kusikani argues that there cannot be no discourse of decolonization, no theory of decolonization without a decolonizing practice, a profoundly thoughtful provocation, but one that has seemingly generated a reductionist view, especially in the right-wing challenges to the decolonial practice. So the last week when we heard the co-owner of Manchester United, Jim Ratcliffe, saying that UK is being colonized by immigrants and migrants. And such loose assertions has provoked thinking that brings forth an understanding that the challenges to decolonization is profound, and challenges to decolonial praxis is profound, but one where history has almost been erased or rewritten or constrained and reduced in order to write, in order to facilitate a political project, which in other terms, has been depoliticizing those who write from Global South. In stating that, I wanted to explore the possibilities of thinking the decolonial projects, of decolonial praxis, as it has been experienced, if not in the current political climate, but in the 1960s and 70s in the global north, particularly in Northern America, in the indigenous Maoism movement in Vancouver, in the US as well, where not just Black radicalism, but also the indigenous movements have been successful in borrowing ideas from the global South and have been able to articulate both through an idea of armed revolution and successfully bring about land reform movements, while also having an identity, the quest of identity being brought into the mainstream in the political realm in otherwise a settler colonial framework of a white supremacist arc. And coming to the question of the Indian context, which I'm quite familiar with, but I also want to, and of course, Professor Menon has made a series of examples that have been brought out. So I don't want to bring back the question on the different examples. I'm not very keen on that, but what I'm keen on is this article that I read about RSS celebrating its centenary and an intellectual conversation wherein they called Professor Deepesh Chakrabarty's Provincialized in Europe as a text that proves that Professor Chakrabarty is the symbolic representation of RSS nationalistic imaginations of a Hindu India. Shocking, but they spent about an hour discussing this text. And what is interesting is that, and I'm going to borrow from the work of Professor Mridula Mukherjee, who says that as an organization, RSS has never participated in any anti-British movement during the entire period of its existence from 1925 to 1947. That is when India became independent. And then she goes on to quote the work of the ideologue of RSS, the Rashtra Swayamsevak Sangatan's ideologue, who wrote, that's Golwalkar, who wrote that anti-British nationalism, that is the anti-colonial movement, in itself was reactionary. It should not be even raised. So they never took part. The only colonizers to RSS is the quote-unquote Muslim invaders, and then they lose about 250 years of history in that course of reading the decolonization project, which is very interesting because there's no chronological invocation of a history during that period of time. So why is then the question is that why is India then become so central with these when these differences exist? So one thing that crossed my mind is that also from reading Ishan's work is that when you invoke a comparison between the fascist imaginations of RSS and that of Europe, fascism outside of Europe has been the most successful project, in fact, quote unquote, indigenous project in India. While there has been castes, there have been different castes, there have been multiple religious identities, yet we don't see a similar fascist agenda being so successfully implemented as a state project in the countries of African continent, who have had the same kind of experience, especially the British colonization. So, for example, whether it's Uganda, whether it is Kenya, there are multiple tribes, and we have had the invocation of autocrats or dictators, but not really the kind of fascist penetration of fascist ideals as in case of India, where there's certainly a very strong, deep-rooted a bigoted ideology, bigoted difference when you have castes, when you have religions, but they've been able to focus on a minority, a particular minority, Muslim minority, to invoke what India is or what Hindu India is. Now, India is different because the theories of Hindu fascism, that is Savarkar and Golwar, explicitly took the Nazis' treatment of Jews as a justificatory model for targeting India's Muslim population. And the tactics that were used in Hindu nationalism, the fascist parts of Hindu nationalism, of Hindutva, mirror quite precisely the tenets of fascism, the strategies, and also how it was implemented and enforced and reinforced. So in subscribing to equate, especially in India, secularism with that of concept of uniformity, the Hindu right, I personally feel, is replicating more of a French model than that of an indigenous model. So I'm not sure how far that's true, but that's seemingly like exactly the exacting standards seeming these Western modeled around the Western countries where secularism has a uniform, singular, linear narrative to it. But then what is being appropriated in the name of modernity or development is in alignment with the goals of capitalist patriarchy, of hegemonic Brahmanism, and Hindu supremacist politics, which I'm sure this is very interesting because what it invokes is a question on how secularism and democracy in India have survived or interact or converse with one another, which in turn is explicitly brought out by the multiple court cases. One that last week was also the case that was sent before the Supreme Court to reconsider the conversation around the Sabrimala temple, where women of menstruating age were not allowed. And the Supreme Court in 2018 passed judgment saying that women should be allowed, of course, by claim of equality before law. But then the Supreme Court sent the case for the constitutional bench, who are looking at the question of whether menstruating women even have the right to enter a temple, which is being maintained by a state fund provided by the taxpaying citizens, of course, including menstruating women, while refusing to actually ask the significant question to whom the temple even belongs. Sabrimala temple, as known, has been widely provoked, has been called in question because it's believed until 1930s it belonged to tribal community and not to some kind of a Hindu Brahminical order. Today, they claim to have a priests who are Brahmins who conduct their rituals there. But colonial records clearly show that was not the case until 1930s, and women clearly entered, of menstruating age, women did enter this temple. But this is, and there are different questions. So when it comes to Hindu temple, the conversation shifts. But when it comes to question of wearing a hijab, the conversation is completely different. That is, a uniformity is being enforced, wherein if you wear hijab, then you're not allowed inside education institutions, where women are right to access a dargah. That's we have, in Mumbai, there was a contestation whether women should be allowed inside the Indian sanctorum of Haji Ali Dargah in Mumbai. And right-wing BJP had a very different attitude towards that. They said everyone should be allowed because India is a democratic country. So principles seemingly differ according to formation of a nationalist ideology, a state wherein that practices and reinforces an idea of a Hindu architecture in defining that India. So my question to Professor Menon is if she could elaborate on this question of secularism and democracy, as it is it a complementary, and how should we look at the BJP having impact on this question of secularism in India today? I have one last question, that is, the interrogation of indigeneity when it comes to conversing with the universal history of capital, which I think I should stop because I'm towards. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh.
Thank you, Anna, but thank you very much. But I would like to respond after maybe taking some more comments and questions. How much time do we have? How long does the session go on till?
So usually we let all the discussants.
Maybe we'll talk.
So usually we let all the discussants intervene, and then you have a chance to reply to them 10, 15 minutes, and then we open it to the floor, both the physical room and the virtual room.
So I should respond to Anna now?
No. There are three discussants. You can respond.
I see.
Yeah,
I see.
You can respond collectively at the end.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Do I have to lean down?
I can.
Please.
Good.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Menon, for your presentation. I thought it was very engaging, and I was really looking forward to the way that you were going to sort of present these two sides of the use of decolonial theory. Thank you, Dr. Castella, for inviting me to discuss this talk. So what Professor Menon has done today is to present and sort of respond to two sides of a persistent debate around decolonial theory and its deployment. And key points that I think we have all gotten from her presentation include there is no pure knowledge that cannot be co-opted or appropriated, as evidenced in the body of knowledge examples that she shared. Materiality involves thought, and as such, it is not merely epistemic. And so my discussion will be based on insights from her presentation, as well as the readings that were shared, and my position as a way of reflection in the next couple of minutes. And so to ground this discussion, we must first look at the two sides in the two readings that were shared. And so we see Sylvia Rivera argue that decolonization cannot be reduced to a thought and it must be a practice. And she warns against sort of this idea that indigenous intellectuals are turned into symbolic ornaments for a multicultural state. And she offers us Chiksi, which is a stained identity that rejects this smooth genetic metaphor of hybridity in favor of sort of a parallel coexistence of opposites. On the other side, we see Ishan track what is seen as this hopeless quest for pure knowledge among the global right, using movements like Hindutva and how it co-opts epistemic disobedience to sort of justify nativism and Brahminical supremacy. So in this regard, the argument there is that right is not decolonizing, it's recolonizing by sort of replacing this heterogeneity with homogeneity. So what we can see here is that it's very clear that we're navigating sort of an intellectual crossroad that can only be assumed to be on the same side if the decolonial theory, as it is deployed by the right or the left, is not immediately followed by the question of what the purpose of deployment is and what it hopes to achieve. And so we see in her presentation that Professor Menon really reflects on the ways that the colonial imagination is still a viable resource. And so against this background, I have four major questions for reflection today. The first is on this question of the epistemic materialist divide. And so we sort of see that in many academic circles, there's the persistent anxiety that the work of the university is just to settle the problem of colonization in the mind, while leaving questions of the land or body and the way it's colonized. And so we see Rivera suggest that ideas that leave the South as raw material and return from the North are regurgitated in academic fashion. And so in that paper, we also see sort of questions around how this knowledge functions in the classroom, what sort of thoughts are used in producing knowledge. And so even though the paper doesn't focus directly here on the other spaces beyond the conventional classroom and that sort of knowledge, my question here is, in reconciling sort of these two views, how do we ensure that decolonial theory doesn't just provide sort of another exotic mask for the academy? So basically the question I'm sort of asking is, how do we make sure in thinking of decolonial thought that we don't create a gate that sort of keeps practice outside? Perhaps to sort of push that question, I also want to touch on the politics of language that is also found in this paper by Rivera, on this idea of what is stained, what is pure, and who sort of policies this language, right? In my own reflections on identity, I find Rivera's Chi-Ixi, this stained identity, a representative of our lived reality. But we also see that there's sort of an institutional gatekeeping that comes up when we talk about publishing and the kind of language that is accepted when we're thinking about publishing these ideas. And although it's true that South-South connections that bridge sort of the African, South Asian perspectives can offer us a way to deepen this decolonial thought, is it possible that the grammars are sort of co-opted because our prioritization of the purpose is sort of making us blind to the vulnerabilities of the theory in itself? So who is the intended audience for these decolonial imaginations? And if we accept that our identities are stained, like she frames it, or they're gray, how does a unified, and I know that you don't speak of unified in this sense as it coming from one place, but as fragments, but how does sort of a comprehensive or consolidated decolonial framework come up, and how does it exist? Or are we just managing this sort of fragmented local resistances that once we consolidate them into theory, it becomes susceptible to this theft that Ishan talks about? So basically, what circles does it circulate? What are the limits of those audiences? And while we speak of it as a language of liberation, are we really thinking about the structures of coloniality that may not be touched while that is being done? The next question that I have is sort of on what you touch on in terms of location. So, of course, one of the basic ideas of decolonial thought is to first think about the theory from sort of a place that you're thinking from. And this is something that you mentioned in your talk. And that is a very productive way to think about decolonial thought. But there are also these colonial ways of being that are reproduced not by the West, but by sort of internal state logic that has already mastered this language of decoloniality. And so my question is, how does this decolonial framework distinguish between this liberatory decolonial imagination and sort of a state-sponsored recolonization when both of them are in knowledge of each other and can use the same vocabulary? And then my last question is on temporality. Is there a post-colonial future? This is a question that comes up very often where there's this idea of us returning to sort of a pristine, nostalgic pre-colonial past. And we see Rivera also talk about not anchoring ourselves in that past, but thinking of a memory that circulates in the present. So in this case, decolonization is not a destination, but a labor that continues. And so my question to you is, in your assessment or in your thought of envisioning a post-colonial future where the imagination is finally free, must we accept decoloniality as this infinite, messy process that is just going to continue with this stained reality? that will constantly just keep resisting the state and will never stop seeking uniformity? And if we assume that it is this continuous movement, what are the markers that will show the progress of deploying this decolonial thought? Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I have your name, please?
My name is Mbasun.
Thank you.
Yeah, you want to take the floor? Yeah, what's over here? And I believe that everybody seems to be working. Exactly, can
you have the camera, please, on the speaker? You're off this screen for me. Can you sit where the earlier two discussants sat? Maybe you could just move. Thank you.
One more time.
Thank you.
One more voice before. Thank you so much, Professor Menon, for this very, very unsettling talk. I want to speak of Cathedra because of having listened to you also of Cathedra. It now makes sense to me, the kind of monologue I had having read the two thinkers with whom you are engaging this anti-colonial and then decolonial thought. So I want to thank you, first of all, for giving us this very interesting three-legged distinction about the post-colonial thought and the decolonial thought. I think this is really further for my class, the class I'm teaching on colonization, post-colonialism, and decolonization. We will have a longer time to reflect on the implication of those three distinctions, because most of the time we think about the formerly colonized world as a vantage point, and that formerly colonized world is extremely differentiated. So I think that's for me the biggest important lesson I picked from the talk. The second one is really that which, of course, the previous two discussants have alluded to, and I need not to repeat, this immunity of knowledge to expropriation that shouldn't really be the point of debate, but is the extent to which that expropriation opens or forecloses possibilities of engaging with critique. And the last, which I really want to focus my discussion on, is this the epistemic, the merely epistemic versus the also materialist implication of the colonial thought. And you end with a very interesting note on the modernity, which seems to be listening to you very well. Perhaps the bridge, or in some other respect also the barrier that will set aside the post-colonial theory and the decolonial theory, the place of modernity in this decolonial thought. So, and I want to really talk a little more for the next few minutes about this place of modernity. You say the talk is born out of the European Enlightenment, and this modernity is definitely, its birthplace is Europe. And so my first kind of rejoinder there will be, what do we miss then in this project, whether we are coming back to reclaim a reappropriated thought of decolonization or anti-colonialism? What do we miss or gain in thinking of modernity as not only European? I'm thinking about the famous Chinese scholar, Wang Hui talks about Chinese modernity, giving us a genealogy post the dynasty of Ming dynasty and Queens, and locates the birth of modernity in the East in terms that displaces Enlightenment as a foundational moment where Western reason and the other thing which you talk about, democracy, become the imprint of the modern. So modernities. We had not so long ago here a talk with another interesting scholar, Tao. How a very famous book, how modernity was preempted, how colonialism preempted modernity, a bunch of African sages in West Africa, from Oiduro to the Kenyan ones here, Odero, have talked about, modernity discourse in African ideal, African modernity, how it was actually preempted by European colonialism. So this place of modernity in the decolonial thought, once pluralized, then it further complicates what is this post-colonial, what is this decolonial thought, particularly if it's thought from the vantage point of another modern that is not just a Renaissance modern. And this invites me to really think with Pato Chatterjee. And I want to paraphrase Chatterjee here, because Pato, in his not what is known for the derivative knowledge, but I'm far interested in this nationalist thoughts and the colonial world. An important book which I think lends itself into this conversation about the modern, the decolonial, and the post-colonial. Chateau talked about the nationalist thought, but I want to paraphrase Chateau's as engaging with what I will read as anti-colonial thought. And Chateau says on page 30 that this anti-colonial thought was to demonstrate the falsity of the colonial claim that backward peoples were culturally incapable of ruling themselves in conditions of the modern world. Instead, this anti-colonial thought asserts that a backward nation could modernize itself while retaining its cultural identity. So I come to the question finally of identity. We have talked about the secular and the religious as a differential in post-colonial thought versus decolonial thought. Pato tells us that as he engages in that book with the three moments, you remember the three moments. There's this particular moment, which is the moment of departure. The moment of departure, engaging with Chattopadhyay, and saying, the knowledge is power is actually the slogan of Western civilization. Knowledge is salvation is the slogan of Hindu civilization. It's a slogan of formerly colonized. So we are not in the knowledge is power claim. We who were formerly colonized, we were speaking from the margins. Then I say knowledge is salvation. This talk tells us that knowledge is damnation. It's not just salvation. But even more insightful about paraphrasing Pato here is that critique, which then the anti-colonial thought will share with the modern thought. And Pato says that, you know, when everything else, the anti-colonial thinker, when has challenged all other bases of colonial rule, there's this one thing which has remained intact, preserved, even embraced, the epistemic foundation of colonial rule. And they says that's the last bastion of privileges. That's the bastion of ratio and the logos. That's the anti-colonial thought has not challenged yet. So my question to Chatterjee and by extension to Menon there would be, so if epistemic privilege among the post-Enlightenment privileged positions have become the last bastion of global supremacy of the cultural value of the Western industrial society, wasn't there any qualitative difference in the ways in which anti-colonial thought animated different decolonial movements, both in the 20th and now in the 21st century? I ask this because it seems to me that we are still having some real, unfortunately, some real intellectual work to be done to come to terms with whether or not the anti-colonial thought is in itself decolonial, or there is a huge conceptual journey we need to take from the anti-colonial thought to arrive at the decolonial thought. And concomitantly, I will ask, is decolonial thought going necessarily going to deliver us to the decolonization platform? Thank you.
Again, may I have your name?
David.
May I have your name?
David, Dr. David Shimba.
David.
So you can now respond to the discussant. You might take 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open the discussion to the audience here and online.
Okay. Thank you so much. They're very, very rich set of comments. So what I might do, so thank you very much to Anna, Mbasu, and David. What I might do is I will try and pick up actually common threads across the three sets of points. And then after I've done that, there might be some specific questions that each of them asked. So you would have noticed that the question that ran through all three discussants' contributions was about, in some way or the other, about practice. So the way in which Anna put it had to do with the Western Academy, and how on the one hand the universities talk about decolonization, on the other hand suppress any kind of protest at the genocide in Palestine and the complicity with Zionist institutions and the state. That was the way in which the question came out from Anna, and she did say decolonial theory must be accompanied by practice. Basun said, talked about, again, about the university, how does knowledge function in classrooms, what is the purpose of deployment, who is the intended audience, again, about practice. And David put it, I thought, very sharply when he said, is anti-colonial thought decolonial? So the first question, so say all of them, and I think all of us are continually, I think, wrestling with this question of, so I think I want to broaden the question, you see. The question is not really, can decolonial thought be, can we see decolonial thought in practice? But the real anxiety is, can our academic selves be there in practice? So is any kind of intellectual thought to be seen in practice. Maybe we're just studying, maybe we're just reading Marx. Is Marx, how do we put Marx into practice as academics? So this is a real anxiety that academics and intellectuals have who are trying to grapple with social transformation. How does our thinking translate into practice? I think so. It's actually a much broader question than that of only decolonization as a framework, or the decolonial framework. And so much true also for feminists, obviously. How does my feminist scholarship translate into practice? And I think there are two kinds of practice. One is intellectual practice and one is political practice. And sometimes we are able to do both. And our goal and our ambition must be to do both. But perhaps there are also moments or parts of our life or different kinds of people whose practice might be purely intellectual. That is to say, intellection is not simply thought, but it is practice, in the sense that if you're in a classroom, if you say my space is the classroom, so I'm going to start with that kind of practice, and then we'll move into the political practice. That is, what do I do with syllabi? How do I change the epistemological framework? How do I frame the world differently so that some of us can go out and actually change the world? But at the moment, I will change the classroom. So decolonizing the university is something that obviously we have seen young people demand throughout the beginning of the 21st century, throughout these 2.5 decades of the 21st century. So there's one kind of practice which is academic, and there's another kind of practice which is political. And that political practice is not something that each and every one of us who is academically involved may be involved in. We may not be in movements, all of us. We may not be engaged. I think we would all like to maintain both registers. And perhaps our politics is in writing, in speaking, and so on. And for others, it may be inside movements. So I think we have to think of practice also as two kinds of practice, and how do we translate the decolonial framework into practice? It would happen at multiple levels. So now we come to the political practice, and it would happen with, for example, in the context of India, it would mean resisting Hindutva politics, both in terms of perhaps actually being part of movements, but also just continuously producing counter-narratives and continuously supporting and strengthening counter-narratives to Brahminical Hinduism. In the context of India, it would be that. In different contexts, it would be different things. So that is the first question, I think, and it's an anxiety, and I'm not attempting to answer the question. It's an anxiety that must always be at the heart of whatever we do, because it is that anxiety which keeps us ethical. The anxiety that our intellection, our thought should not remain purely academic. And we want our academics to transform both intellectual practice as well as political practice. And we would find different ways of doing that. And I think we should always be alert to that. And I share this anxiety, and I live with this anxiety, and I think we should sustain this anxiety. It's not an anxiety that is going to be resolved in some fashion. A second theme that ran through all three discussions, I think, was references to modernity. And I think perhaps I should clarify that when I refer to modernity as emerging from the European Enlightenment, I'm referring to a particular constellation that has, in a sense, colonized the space allotted to the term modernity. So what is happening when someone like Wang Hui, and those were actually very good instances that David gave us when we think about Wang Hui, or for that matter, Kusikanki, whom you all read, she talks about indigenous modernities. So in Kusikanki's decolonial practice, modernity is not something to be rejected, but it's not the modernity of the European Enlightenment. So we have to remember what happens is that in all these decades of challenge to the abstractions produced as universalisms by the European Enlightenment, that hubris, that claim to universalism and abstraction has been challenged in multiple ways. But when we see the challenge, we should not forget the power that this framework has had in all our parts of the world. So what we are calling, when we say modernity, just the term modernity, it refers to, and I refer to, a particular set of features, a constellation of features, which is the way in which Kaviraj puts it. You may have read A Revisionist Theory of Modernity by Sudipta Kaviraj. It's a very interesting essay. He calls it a constellation of features. A set of features emerges in Europe in the 18th century and 17th to 18th centuries. And those features are associated with modernity, where the individuation, secularization, capitalist industrialization, the modern rise of the modern state, the idea of the abstract individual. There is a set of features which are then seen as a module that is translatable across the globe. And some people are not really equipped to adopt that. They're backward, they're primitive, etc., etc., and so they have to be taught these. So that is what I call modernity, and that modernity is what the decolonial framework is criticizing. Now, it is possible to say 2-3 things. I said one of those things, that one of the arguments we could make is that and I make that when decolonial theory is criticized by the left and post-colonial theory, that there are good things that have come from the Enlightenment. It is both, as Deepesh Chakrabarty put it, inadequate but essential. It's indispensable but inadequate. Now, when you say that, what are you saying? That it gave us certain values which we want to hold on to. And we find that when it comes to, say, for example, caste radicals and caste activists in India and people who follow B.R. Ambedkar, and B.R. Ambedkar himself did take those values very seriously. But one would argue, and this is the kind of thing Wengrow and Graeber argue, and this is the kind of thing that one is saying, that all the values that are associated with the Enlightenment don't come from Kant and so on. They are actually there in other parts of the world, but then we don't have to call it modernity. You see, that's what I would say. So I am wondering about the value. So I may not be fully in agreement with Kusikanki or Wang Hui entirely in this idea of we had our modernity before the colonialists came and sabotaged it. I'm not sure that that's the way I would think about modernity. I would think about modernity as this module, and I would think about various elements that we value, such as equality, democracy, etc. And we don't have to call that modernity. I don't understand what is at stake in calling it modernity. So that was the second point. And the second point that I think runs across everybody's thoughts. I'll just take a minute to now look at specific maybe one specific question from one or two of you. So Anna, I'm not sure that this is the context in which to discuss secularism and democracy. I'm not sure. I feel that's a whole other discussion which may not be, we could have it, but I don't see how it can be had within the framework of what we're discussing. One kind of thing that I would say, and this is what I've argued in my book, Secularism as Misdirection, is that secularism is a strategy of rule. And it can be used by authoritarian states and it can be used by democratic states, but secularism is also entirely compatible with capitalism. Secularism is entirely compatible with the idea of the abstract individual, and so on. So So I would say that, and that's what I've argued in that book, that the word secularism is actually, the term secularism is actually, it's like a smoke and mirrors act. When you say that, it's like we all know what we're talking about, but in fact, on the side, something else is happening, and we're not looking at, and I talk about three features that are ignored by the discourse of secularism: capitalism, caste, and in the Indian context, caste, and the idea of an individual rooted in a spiritual universe. So I would only say that right now, rather than get into the entire discussion there. I was actually, is there a post-colonial future? Basun asked, is there a post-colonial future? And is that post-colonial future a sort of a pristine, romantic, pre-colonial past? And I don't think the decolonial framework leads us to that. I don't see Kusikanki doing that, and I certainly don't see any of the other scholars we associate, Maldonado Torres and others, Mignolo. I don't see an invocation of the past in order to reinstate it. I see an invocation of something pre-colonial in order to reproduce it in this time and space. So I don't actually, so is there a so I do think actually that there would be no one point of transformation. So a post-colonial future is something that is being produced every day in different parts, in different ways, and it's a continuous struggle. Although the world that we right now see is a reasserted imperialist world, right? We heard the US Secretary of State, you must have all seen and read that video where he spoke to the European leaders in Spain, and he said that there was a time when we took civilization to the rest of the world, and that period in 1945 there was decolonization and everything collapsed, and we have to get it back, and we will do it. And it was the most astonishing restatement of the imperialist project. So today we are actually living in an era where imperialism is being claimed as something that the European countries and the US are going to do. So in that context, every struggle, every corner is something that we need to protect and fight. And the question that came up from David separately, actually both David's questions I think address, is anti-colonial thought. Decolonial was a very lovely way of putting it. And I think anti-colonial thought need not be decolonial. The decolonial project is another project, because you can be anti-colonial, replace, as I said with Hindutva, what happens, you can throw out the colonial master and replace it with the dominant internal elite. So the decolonial project then still remains to be done after the anti-colonial movement. The anti-colonial movement is only one very slim part of the political project. So I think I'll stop here. I don't think I've answered everything, but I hope some kind of discussion, some kind of thoughts have emerged.
Thank you so much. There is so much more to reflect on given your responses. So we open the floor to the audience here. See, there is a question, and we collect 3 questions. Are you okay? We collect 3 questions, and maybe you respond to them.
3 questions is fine.
So one is online, and I will read it to you, or you can read it also by yourself. Okay, let's start with these questions. Gentleman down there? Yes, please. Maybe you can come on this station because you're not audible otherwise.
Hello. Let's start with my question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for this talk. I really appreciated all the details, especially the side notes about Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott and David Graeber's discussion about the Enlightenment. I have one specific question. So assuming that theory does lead to practice and sidestepping the whole anxiety of it, I'm just wondering, besides the critiques, the breakdowns, the challenges, the deconstructions of the notions of universalism, rationalism, caste, gender, all these discussions that we do to decolonize, my point is, where does the imagination part come from? So what does it look like? What are the sources of inspiration that we look to? And what are some substitutes that we generate? And do they come from the past or the future? So I'm just asking, what does the imagination part really look like? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me read aloud. I can read aloud.
I can see a question in the chat. I can see a question in the chat.
Yes, but let me read it loud also for the audience here. They might not be able to see. So the question is from Adrian. The resurgence of the global right is unfolding within a broader corresponding context of a resurgence of imperialism and anti-imperialist competition. What does the global left, in particularly post-colonial theory, have to say as regards the specter of imperialism as an ongoing, actual existing phenomenon?
Is there a third question?
Yes. Nelson, please come here.
Thanks, Prof, for the paper. My question is, and maybe a comment comes from one of the papers that we read for this seminar, Kafila Collective Exploration, is since 2006. The first one, a comment, but also a question, is that when I was reading this paper, there is an explicit critique of the right. And so the question is, where is the critique of the left, and where do you see the future? I mean, we are speaking here, but we're also imagining the future. And here you are telling us that the right has appropriated the colonial discourse. And I'm asking, do you have, what is the critique of the left? Because I'm seeing there is this impression of a double critique. But when you read through this paper, you see there is one side that is being critiqued, and you find there is another side that you seem to be romanticizing, something like that. That's the impression I got. The second one, in this particular paper, where is the critique of capitalism particularly? Then, so the other question also comes from this very assumption is, and what is the possibility? I mean, we are talking about decolonization and the likes, but what is the possibility of moving beyond these dual frameworks? Well, right, the left. So what next if these frameworks have limitations? Are we going to operate within them? I mean, you are from the global south. That is the assumption. I don't know if India has declared itself non member of the global south, but we are from the global south, and we have two frameworks. We have the right, we have the left, but all these frameworks seem colonial. They do not originate from where we come from. So what next? Is there a possibility of having a framework that emerges from the global south? I mean, in an attempt to move beyond these dual frameworks? Or do you see possibilities of particular forms of emancipation is, even when we are thinking from within these two frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with the first question. Where does the imagination come from? From the past or the future? That was very nicely put, I thought. So I think the imagination is there. It comes from the intellectuals of our particular spaces. I mentioned Fanon, I mentioned Ambedkar. There are feminist thinkers, there are indigenous Kusiganki talks about indigenous thinkers and movements. She uses, terms that come from indigenous languages. So the imagination comes both from the past and from the future and from the present. And I think we see it all around us. It's not as if we have to wait for some moment when it's going to emerge. The assuming theory leads to practice is the way you put it. The imagination to challenge comes from all these different spaces. I mean, if you think about the South African students' movement for, the roads must fall. Right now, what an imaginative slogan. It came from the pulling down of a statue, roads must fall. But after that, it was fees must fall. So there was this whole must fall being used as a strong decolonial, powerful student statement. Where did that imagination come from? It comes from collectivities. It comes from reading. It comes from practice. It comes from people who have actually written and fought on our lands, and they'll come from all our different contexts. So Fanon for me is as much an inspiration as he is for those in Africa. And I think Ambedkar might be an inspiration for people outside India as well. I mean, for activists. And there are many other. So I would say the imagination comes from us in a sense. The question by Adrian, I feel that when you say that it is, you're right, the resurgence of the global right is unfolding within a resurgence of imperialism and inter-imperialist competition. That's very clear. What does the global left have to say? The global left, at one level, says all that we expect, in the sense that everything that we see happening from the powers that be is challenged and criticized by left voices. We are surrounded by, we find we find large numbers of left voices that are critical of genocide in Palestine, imperialism, etc., etc. So there is no very complicated, different analysis. It's very clear that imperialism is the problem. Imperialism is trying to regain a certain kind of it's not legitimacy, but a certain kind of normalization. When Rubio, the US Secretary of State, said all these things, there was a certain kind of normalization. He was speaking in a room of white people, and he spoke with the kind of casual, the way in which elites would speak in their drawing rooms. I mean, it's not like the world is watching. He doesn't care, right? They don't care. So that analysis is coming to us from the left, and we are drawing on traditions of left criticisms of imperialism. The question might be, is there a global left? I don't think there is a global right, and I don't think there's a global left. There are multiple kinds of global rights and multiple kinds of global lefts, and there are ways in which all these different elements of the left are trying to connect. For example, Palestine connected us. Gaza connected us. So there was a way in which different kinds of left politics came together over Gaza. When you come together over Gaza, it's not just some kind of sadness about the tragedy of the genocide. Of course, it's sadness. We live with that sadness. It's just intolerable, the grief of what has happened, what is happening and has happened to Palestine. But you will see that all these resistances and all these public kind of demonstrations were in fact theorizing imperialism, right? They were theorizing the way in which Zionism functions and in which imperialism functions. So I think we do have a very clear understanding now of what imperialism is, and we might want to add that there is internal colonialism. I mean, in every state, in every country, there's internal colonialism by the dominant elites. And that brings me to so I'll just come to the third question. What is the critique of capitalism? Any kind of critique of imperialism involves a critique of capitalism. So if you're asking within the decolonial framework, is there a critique of capitalism? Absolutely. The critique of capitalism is central to the decolonial framework, and it would not be interesting for me unless that critique was there. This term appropriation, I can see another question. I got a bit distracted. I won't look at it right now. I just want to conclude with my response to the third question, that which actually links up with some of the earlier questions as well, that when we use the term appropriation, we must remember that the process is not necessarily all fully successful and complete. So if we say that the global right is appropriating the decolonial framework, it's appropriating it, but it's an attempt. It's an attempt. It's not as if it's now over. We cannot use the decolonial framework because the right has won it. It's not a football which one side wins or the other side wins. You see, it is in fact a process of struggle, and we are going to also continue to use elements of that framework. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. So we have another series of questions. So we start with Waha, then we have Yosef.
May I take 1 minute, just 1 second? There's someone at the door. I will literally take 1 second to send them off.
Sure, you may go ahead.
Sorry, I'm back.
Right. Am I audible to you?
Yes, thank you. Yes, you are.
Okay, my name is Waha. I'm a student here at MISA. I have a question about the rules. I mean, from your experience and from your talk, you seem to be connecting theory and practice in a deeper level. And I wanted to ask about the rules in which the knowledge of resistance play or carry out its, I don't know, like pushback, because we're very overwhelmed with the reality of modernity and postmodernity and imperialism. And the same way that he said that Gaza connected us in a way, it also showed us how defeated we are, because it brought imperialism and violence and inequality to the surface in a way that everything was very seen live. And it also made us realize how defeated we are, how underfunded our resistance is, and how power is just unbalanced in the world. So I'm just wondering, how far can we push within the master's rules? We live in a very, I mean, not only about the current global politics, but also for the past 2 decades or 3 decades, and maybe post the Cold War. Things have been unfolding in a very rapid way, and the same way that so many scholars and practitioners have been trying to put together like indigenous and produce indigenous knowledge, it seems to be confined within our spaces, within a space like this, like MISA, for example. And it doesn't seem to find a way out, that could create some sort of popularism that is adopted by masses or grassroots or something like that. So I'm just wondering, how far can we push our reality beyond the rules of the master?
Hi, Professor Menon. Joseph here. So this notion of internal colonialism. So the usual critique directed against this notion is that it tends to trivialize the uniquely European or external nature of modern colonialism in the rest of the world. So I was wondering, is there a need to be cautious about this notion of internal colonialism? Do you have at least a provisional critique of this notion that we should be cautious about? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Menon, for such an enlightening presentation. My name is Abdu, a third-year student here at Miser. Let me share some questions that arose from my reading of Sylvia and Ihsan's piece, and let me hear what you say about it. Let me start with Sylvia's piece. I think I am audible, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. While highly appreciating Sylvia's emphasis on decolonization as practice, not as theorizing from the ivory tower, and her initiatives to take indigenous life worlds as a vantage point, I found her notion of indigenous modernity to be questionable. You partly addressed this question, but let me raise it again because it is very important. Why does one need to associate an indigenous world that doesn't conceive of linear teleological time with modernity? Doesn't modernity presuppose a linear teleological time frame? Doesn't this make the notion of indigenous modernity an oxymoron? Let me proceed to Ihsan's piece. I appreciate Ihsan's timely and critical intervention concerning the use and abuse of decolonization. He perceptively reflects on the current right-wing misappropriation of decolonial and anti-colonial language to justify anti-immigration and ethnocentric rhetoric. Unfortunately, Ihsan's piece does not include regular voices in the discussion. This is at least partly elitist for me. The essay focuses solely on the problematics of how right-wing elites appropriate post-colonial and decolonial tropes, failing to analyze crucial complications in the left-right dichotomy. How neat is such a dichotomy for regular people? For instance, in the case of the last US election, why did we witness left-oriented people abandoning Harris to vote for Trump? Yeah, thanks so much.
Should we also just look, maybe you could read out Derek's question also, and then we can take all four.
The question was a comment on Nelson, and he's saying, is Nelson proposing that Africa should go out and colonize, reproduce colonialism so that it emerges with its own acceptable version of the vice? I think is a question.
So I'll just start with Derek, and I don't read him as doing this, and I'm not sure where this is coming from. Nothing that I have read, not read everything that Nelson Maldonado Torres has written, but what I've read doesn't. So my answer would be no. I think he's not proposing this. There must be a reason why you put the question like this, but I would say no. So the first question, Gaza showed us how defeated we are, was actually very poignant, and you're right. And at some level, it is a feeling of absolute devastation. I mean, we feel it, so how much more the Palestinian people must be feeling it. But there is a general feeling that, but what I see, the way I see it is that what we are witnessing is a break in the historical idea of progressivism, where representative democracy is all we have, where democracy and representative democracy have become coalesced into one thing, as if to say the only way we can be democratic is by having people represent us, right? And what I see in the last 2.5 decades in particular is that there is a decisive break between the people and states. If you think about the war on Iraq, for example, if you think about the hundreds of thousands of people who marched all over the world against the American invasion of Iraq. If you think about that, this happened in India as well, but all over the world. And yet the invasion of Iraq continued. Every single thing has been, and there was, there were the Occupy protests, there are the Indignados in Spain, there was what is called the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolts. We see a complete break between the people and the states, and we see that what is called democracy is actually oligarchies ventriloquizing the people. This is what we see. So I see this moment. I do understand the sense of defeat. I feel it myself sometimes. I mean, I try not to, but it does, because we have to keep fighting. But I see this in a larger historical moment as a moment where we must recognize that we need to restructure democracy so that it is more direct. I'm not sure how that will be done. How will direct democracy be produced and reproduced? It will be extremely heterogeneous. But representative democracy has pretty much shown us it's exhausted its capacity to fool us anymore. Representative democracy has exhausted its capacity to fool us. So we keep voting and we'll keep performing our democratic functions, but you will see that this break is clear. These are the governments we elected, but they're doing exactly the opposite of what the people want. If you look at the US and Europe, the leaders are doing one thing, the people are doing another thing. So I want us to see this moment not as one of despair, but as people who have the privilege of being able to think. I feel we should theorize this moment differently and think about what are the forms of direct democracy that could emerge historically. Not in my lifetime, maybe we're talking of long historical processes, but certainly in your lifetime. Are these alternative theories confined to the class, to our classrooms? To some extent, but I don't think to the extent that you imagine, because everywhere we look, we see university students, young people are at the forefront of struggles. So clearly, these are not like just tiny classrooms. This is a much bigger movement. There are connections with workers groups and so on, as was happening in the US. So I don't think that these alternative theories are confined to classrooms. There are ways in which we recognize, for example, we find that school children know now about the material infrastructural costs of AI, right? There's a whole ethical set of debates about AI, but there is the material infrastructure, water, trees, labor. Those questions are coming up and they're being raised in schools by school children. So I'm not very hopeless about this knowledge being confined. It's going out in different ways. It's going out through newspaper articles. It's going out through social media. We have a lot of problems with social media, and there are many, but social media is also actually spreading a lot of the kind of things that we want should go out into the public domain. Yourself, hi, nice to meet you. You've been very good with coordinating this whole thing. Thank you for all the work that you've put in. Your question was about whether I would be trivializing the term colonialism by talking about internal colonialism. I don't think so. I would continue to use it. I would be, open to any kind of debate and discussion on it, but I would continue to use it, because if we are going to use colonialism to mean an external force extracting resources of a particular land and using those resources and extracting those resources violently through oppression, through silencing, through mass extermination of peoples and so on, let's say that colonial, so this ties up to the question of is anti-colonial decolonial, that ends. But if the process continues by supposedly the nation state now is internal, but the nation state acts towards populations within the country exactly the way in which these external forces did. So if you have, for example, indigenous, for example, I talked about the Nicobar the Nicobar project. All over India, wherever there are, in India, the word, as you might know, the word tribal is used, and tribes is a constitutional term. It doesn't have the same implications here as it does in Africa. So if you look at what is happening in the tribal belts of India, rich in resources, and they're being extracted by the Indian state to finance capitalism for an elite, which is not, so those people are being exterminated, they're losing their lands. So this is external to them. Once a nation state is formed, the myth that this nation state is now inclusive breaks down very quickly. So I think it's very much an external force continuing to extract resources and so on. And I find the term internal colonialism extremely accurate, actually. I don't think it's particularly uniquely European. The last question had to do with, so Kusikanki, is more like a comment. I completely agree with you. I did hint at it when, I did also say it in passing, as you noticed, that the idea of indigenous modernity is questionable, because I don't understand what is at stake in continuing to retain the term modernity. What does it do for us? What does it do for us theoretically? What does it do for us politically, to insist that we had modernity too before you came and ruined it for us? I don't get that kind of argument. And you very correctly, I think, call it an oxymoron, and it is predicated upon certain kind of progressivist narratives, and I agree with you. Your critique of Ishan, I'll just leave it there. I'm not committed to defending, both these readings. I think the right-left dichotomy is sustainable. So I'm not sure why you feel that regular people, in the sense, I'm not sure what you mean by regular people. I guess you mean non-academics and not people who are not overtly political. I guess you mean that, but I'm just thinking that, so maybe a lot of terms that we produce in our world, in the academic intellectual world, they're not terms that non-academics might use, but without the use of even by not using the term, I think it would be clear to people what it is that they reject and what it is that they accept. So the regular people who reject fascism may not call it fascism, may not think they're being anti-right-wing, but they do reject fascism in different ways. Even in this country, in this country, you find people rejecting Hindu Rashtra who are not only the minorities. People who have the label of Hindu also reject Hindu Rashtra. So I think it's a conceptual distinction we do need to maintain. It's a conceptual distinction. So is black and white a conceptual distinction. If you actually put the color palette, they'll start shading, right? So while we do need to recognize that dichotomy shade, these conceptual distinctions are crucial for us to think with. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So we have another cycle of questions. Okoth, Tosin, and myself. Yeah. Okoth, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon, for your fascinating presentation and your work. My name is Okoth. I am interested in commenting on the replacement theory in the material, in one of the materials you availed to us. So I was actually looking at the replacement theory in history, like the history of it. So it's not really something that we could say it is of recent, because there are so many other books talking about the same thing. The author of the replacement theory is advancing. For instance, the work of Madison Grant, when he writes about the passing of the great race. So I get intrigued and ask, how is this idea of the replacement theory getting transformed? Is it really intensifying? Did it fade when the first authors wrote about it? Do we look at a possibility where it is intensifying? Because there are scholarships which have been inspired by the great replacement theory, and they are tending to read the context in the global south based on the replacement theory. For instance, in India, they read like the politicians, the Hindu politicians are fearing a possibility of the Muslims taking over. And then in South Africa, they also fear a possibility of what? Nigeria taking over in the economy. And also in Malaysia, they're trying to discourage immigration from India. So what effective strategies can we really deploy as scholars from the Global South to counter some of this? Thank you so much.
Hello, Professor Menon. Thank you very much for a very fascinating lecture. I am quite interested in this conversation you broach with, around subaltern studies and decolonial theory. And first, I am really interested in your own positionality as an Indian scholar located within the Indian Academy. I'm really interested in what would be your internal critique, or what is your internal critique of subaltern studies, and how, for instance, how did that critique or dissatisfaction with subaltern studies lead you to engage with decolonial theory? In other words, what is it that decolonial theory can do that subaltern studies cannot do? So the second question I would like to raise is regard to the idea of time that animates writings on decolonial theory. It seems that there is a rejection of the linear conception of time, which is central to Western modernity. So what alternative conception of time should we be using to think of other possibilities of modernity outside Western modernity? Thank you.
Okay. Professor Menon, maybe a couple of questions on my side. So the first question, I'd like to connect the imagination, practice, and theory. So you've talked about this distinction between intellectual practices and political practices. So at the level of when we learn or we teach the colonial theory or decolonization, it seems to me that what is demanded as well is that you learn about the decolonization and you also have to do it in a way or another, or you are called to do it. So what does it mean? What does it involve at the level of the self? Let's start from homework. What does it involve at the level of the self when a lot of the history of violence are stored in the body? And I wonder if the talk of epistemology, how much space there is for the moving beyond the Cartesian schema. So the body for a space of, I'm talking about this because, and I want to connect it to the issue of rejection. If we look at, for instance, the experience of Rhodes Must Fall, where the pain and suffering was self-declared by students, black pain and black suffering. And at the center of the movement initially were queer activists, which were excluded right away. And there has been also an unleash of anger. And so this is not to pathologize the anger, but to understand how is that related to the possibility of decolonization. And so I wonder to what extent, what is it, where is the target that has to be rejected? Where is it located? And to what extent can it be rejected insofar as we can do it intellectually, but the law, the modern state function like the modern state, the market function like the market, and so these are modern, however alternative we want to be. So this is one question. The second question is it's more maybe historical, but also theoretical. In this discussion of the decolonial, what is the space, and in connection to India? So I was interested in how, from the experience, the historical experience of colonialism of India, somebody like you or others might be attracted by the colonial theory. Theory travels, right? So there's no problem with that. But there seems to be, both in the case of India and in the case of the colonial, an interesting role of Islam. So Islam, in some sense, has a conditional possibility of 1948 India, 47 India, and the exclusion of Islam in large part, it seems to me, in the reflection on the construction of modernity from the colonial scholars. And so somebody, for instance, that we want to do the decolonization thinking and practice from Islam, to take one example, why would it be appealed by the colonial theory? So what I'm trying to say, and I'm attracted to some aspect of it, it seems to me that the colonial theory is nevertheless connected to the secular knowledge coming from the social sciences. And I wonder, for people, the general people Abdul was referring to, what work does it do? Thank you so much.
Again, there's a comment. It's just a comment. Perhaps you could read out Jonathan's comment.
Yes.
I agree with the comment.
Let me read it also. Let me read it loud because maybe it's not visible here. Looks like the formerly colonized need to reverse anthropology so that we study the former colonial outfits as means of destabilizing colonial epistemologies.
completely agree, Jonathan. I think we should be doing more of this kind of research, actually. Okay, so Okof asked about the great replacement theory. Is it intensifying, and how does one respond to it? So I'm not very familiar with the great replacement theory. I mean, I know what it says, but it's not, I haven't read around it. I'm not very familiar with the scholarship around it or the debates around it. But going by the basic understanding I have, and from your question, is it intensifying? Is it transforming? To some extent, yes, because we see a huge growth in xenophobia. We see a huge growth in, borders being closed. But we also see, for example, in the US, we see in Minnesota, you must be seeing, there is a community coming together against ICE and against the taking away of immigrants illegally, and the illegal abduction of immigrants by ICE. Now that's a lot. There are a lot of white people involved in those protests, and they're really risking their everyday lives. So what I feel is, yes, there is an intensifying of the great replacement theory, but there's also a response to it, which is countering it. What should our response be? We have to counter it with, well, we have to do it with the weapons we have, which is, for example, research. Is it true? Is it actually correct? For example, in India, there is this continuous production by the Hindu right that Muslims will become the majority, which is impossible. They're like 14%. Hindus are, the 80 to 82%. This is not going to happen in millennia. But we know that such fears and anxieties that they're trying to provoke are not based on facts, and our producing counterfacts is important, but those counterfacts are not going to change their narrative. So I guess we have to keep doing politics. We have to keep making the arguments. And we have to make different kinds of counter arguments, partly based on fact, partly based on counter reasoning, asking questions like, why does it matter which community is in the majority? What if you build a nation state which actually protects all minorities for the future? Then anybody could be in the minority and it would still be a democratic state. There are different kinds of arguments we can make. I don't think we have to consider that the battle is lost simply because these claims are growing. This question about how did I move from subaltern studies to decolonial theory? I was a little amused by that question, because it seemed as if you were implying there's like this journey there's a journey towards decolonialism, decolonial theory that one would make if one were from a South Asian academic or an Indian academic, that we would naturally have turned to subaltern studies first. You have to understand, I come from a tradition of feminist scholarship and feminist practice. So I did not I find a lot of subaltern studies work very productive. I don't have like a sustained critique of subaltern studies or any such thing. I actually find Partha Chatterjee is someone I've learned so much from. And I mean, there have been very, very good separate essays which have been excellent, Shahid Amin's work, etc., etc. So it's not a dissatisfaction with subaltern studies. That's too narrow. It's a dissatisfaction with a broader secular modernist framework, which takes as natural that modernity, that constellation of features that I described as coming from Europe in the 18th century, in the 17th and 18th century. It's a dissatisfaction with that. It is a recognition of the problems with this model, which led me to find decolonial theory exciting. And despite the argument, which I fully take, that location matters, I don't think that location fixes theory. So when theory travels, it gets taken on board in different ways, and that's the strength of a theory. Just as subaltern studies traveled to Latin America So did decolonial theory travel to South Asia? So so that was the first question. Why? What do? So the main points I think for me are the critique of modernity that decolonial framework offers, the need to engage with spirituality and movements and people engaging in spirituality. That is another element of decolonial theory that I find useful. The insistence on heterogeneity and all of that. So there are many features of decolonial theory that I find very useful, and it fits in with the scholarly and practice tradition I come from, which is feminism in South Asia. You asked about time, also the rejection of the linear conception of time. What is the alternative concept of time? See, the linear concept of time includes the idea of anachronism. So when you look at an indigenous person, a tribal person in the Indian context, that person is seen as belonging to another time. They're in the past. They're in another century. They're not in the 21st century. This is what a linear conception of time does. That time moves. And now we're in the era of capitalism and modernity. So anyone who believes that a mountain is sacred and fights to the end to prevent that mountain, this has happened, the Niyamgiri Hills, to protect that mountain from capitalist exploitation because they believe that mountain is spiritual, that those people are seen to be living in another time. But in fact, they're not. They're living in the 21st century. They're in the same time period as you. So time is heterogeneous. So the alternative conception of time is that it's not empty and linear, but that it's heterogeneous, that what we call the present is heterogeneous. And there are multiple kinds of ways of thinking about time. In India, this is actually something we literally live in multiple calendars. That is to say, we have a Gregorian calendar. Well, actually, it's true for other countries as well, including yours. Muslims have their own calendar by which different sacred moments are mapped. There are different kinds of Hindu calendars which map different kinds of moments. So we live in multiple times, actually. And the idea of linear time is problematic for that reason. So I think the role of Islam, let me start with the second question, that the exclusion of Islam, you're right, appears to have been absolutely central to India's conception of itself, even Nehruvian India's, that is to say, even at the time of independence, when India was presenting itself as secular, there was very much the idea that Hindus are the majority. We have a 4,000, 5,000-year-old history. And there's a way in which one has to make space for the Muslim. So there has been, this is something that we do see, the exclusion of Islam, the inability to engage with Islam. And also in India, we find a kind of a space that is considered to be abstract, but which is actually coded as Hindu. That is to say, the public domain, now very much so. Now it's very explicit, but even in earlier times, there was a way in which certain kinds of inaugural ceremonies, which are seen as cultural, were actually Hindu. Chanting of maybe a verse, a motto in Sanskrit, etc. So this is why in this, I think you're asking why in this context do I find decolonizing the decolonial framework useful, or why am I or why are scholars here drawn to it? It's not a large number of scholars who use the framework, but some of us do. I think it is precisely to bring back what has been excluded, including Islam, but also including different kinds of spiritualities and different notions of time, and just to revalue heterogeneity and incommensurabilities. I think a certain kind of secular modern practice of academics doesn't permit incommensurabilities, and it seems to me that the decolonial framework does. So the first one I would take more as a comment, where I agree with you that the decolonial practice has to start with the body. And what you pointed out about the way in which queer people were then marginalized, we find this happens in many, many movements. In India, in the very powerful citizens movement campaign against a particular law which was disenfranchising, leading to the disenfranchising of Muslims, there were these huge protests all over the country. And one of the groups at one of the massive iconic protest sites was called itself Muslim and Queer, and was part of that struggle. But there were strong critique. There was at least one or two strong critiques from within the community, saying that you're bringing in something completely un-Islamic and we don't need your support, kind of a thing. So that happens, and we have to, the internal disagreements and inability to connect is something that is very much something we have to deal with on an everyday basis in any struggle. It has to just keep coming back. We have to not let it be repressed. We have to make the questions come back.
Thank you very much. Let me see. We still have maybe 10 minutes. Let's see if there are any more questions. Yes, one more question. Yes, please come to the floor.
Hello.
Hi, you're back.
Hi. I had one more question that I haven't quite fully formulated, but I really wanted to get your take on it, and it's regarding appropriation. So when we say that the right appropriates anti-colonial thought and co-opts it to say that their modernity was hijacked by the West, and obviously this could be done with an intention of malice or being politically motivated. But my question is, to explain it, there's the seminal quote of Audre Lorde, "The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house." And so I'm wondering, regarding this sentence that is appropriation itself, there's a lot of talk from Donna Haraway's idea of cyborg and Leigh Paperson's edition, where there's an idea of repurposing colonial practices to new ends, including decolonizing organizations that traditionally don't serve the less advantaged and the marginalized. And so the idea is sometimes there is a way to appropriate certain tools, but at the same time, it's almost antithetical to the quote, the master's house will dismantle, the master's tools will not. So I'm wondering how you feel about appropriation here, and especially how they appropriate anti-colonial thought. Is there any benefit to this besides the harm that it does? Is it completely a net negative, is my question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is that the last question, or are we?
I think it's the last question, yes.
Okay. Thank you. There are, I think, at least two ways in which we can talk about the appropriation by the right of the decolonial framework and decolonial language. One is actually quite simple and explicit, which is that one has to use this very non-academic term, but it's hypocritical because they don't actually, in practice, show decolonizing. they keep talking about decolonizing, but they're simply replacing the West with the internal elite. So you can see that, for example, in the case of India, on the one hand, you keep talking of decolonization, but when you replace any kind of colonial element, you replace it with something Brahmanical. But you also are perfectly content. So the Indian government is perfectly content with a trade deal with the US, which no other country has accepted. I mean, I think it was Zimbabwe which recently rejected some kind of deal with the US, but the Indian government is completely comfortable with playing second fiddle, with playing junior partner to the US. So where does your decolonization go then? So that's one kind of very simple level of challenge to the claim of decolonizing. But you're right. The appropriation can happen at any level. There could be ways in which we could appropriate to our ends. But I think the question here is, so if your question is, can appropriation sometimes have some kind of positive effect vis-a-vis our own goals? It's possible. It's possible. For example, I'm thinking of, I did say that caste, for example, I went into that a little bit, that caste oppression was something that the British, for their own purposes, they weren't concerned with equality. They were concerned with creating divisions. But in that process, they opened schools for Dalit children. Dalit children were able to go to school, which was not possible before the British came, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a way in which British laws and British claims to equality actually benefited Dalits. So you could call that an appropriation, right, by Dalit intellectuals and activists of certain elements of colonial rule. So appropriation is context specific. Appropriation is not in and of itself illegitimate. What is the appropriation for? What is it that is being appropriated? What is it that is being, what is the goal of that appropriation, etc.? Once you ask these questions, then as intellectuals, we can make certain judgments about those kinds of appropriations. So I find the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house very powerful, but again, I'm not sure that I would adopt it as an adage, because one could use the master's tools precisely to dismantle the master's house and then abandon those tools once you've dismantled. But I think we all know what Oslo was saying, but and I think it's a very powerful statement, but you use this term repurposing of practices. I think that's entirely possible, and we would have to judge it context by context.
Professor Menon, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your generosity and sharing with us illuminating thoughts.
I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. I can see all of you. It's lovely to see all of you.